Hey, you. Thanks for tapping into some Untapped Keg podcast where we explore different perspectives of sobriety and mental health. Here, we believe there's only one right way to sobriety. That's the way that works for you. I'm RJ Zimmerman, and today I'm very excited and grateful to be joined by a certified recovery coach, a certified yoga and meditation teacher, founder of Sun and Moon Sober Living, the community and podcast, person who coaches people through their sober curious journeys virtually and in person and runs in-person retreats. Mary Tilson, how are you doing today, Mary?
I'm great. It's so great to chat with you again. Thanks for having me.
Same. And for those, we'll have a link to it, but I was on your podcast recently and it was a really wonderful conversation. And I'm excited to continue that because the way that you and I both approach life in general is how we approach life, right? The sober recovery, sober curious journey. And it's really cool, like that holistic experience. For those who are catching you for the first time, could you give us a little bit of background into yourself?
Sure, absolutely. So I have currently been sober. It will be 11 years in April. And yeah, very exciting. And I started drinking very young. I was about 13 years old. And, that really began, I was exposed to alcohol from a pretty young age. And it was very, very normalized. Grew up in a house where there was nightly drinking, and I was, witnessing very high functioning drinking all the time. And I just thought, that's what adults do to take the edge off. It's how you connect with people, how you socialize, how you have fun, how you grieve, that whole storyline. And so as soon as I certainly wasn't old enough, but as soon as I had access to alcohol with my friends, we started experimenting. And right away, I was experimenting with alcohol and weed at about the same time. And I just remember feeling like, all of the insecurities that you deal with at that age. And it kind of just felt like I could be so much more at ease in my body and comfortable with myself. And so it really became central to my social life and my social interactions from that point on. And I feel like I went through pretty much all of high school pretty unscathed in terms of the drinking. Like, I definitely had some close encounters with the police and things like that, parties getting broken up, but I always just got away. And so it never felt like, even though I was starting to, definitely I had my experiences of drinking way too much. It never felt like a problem to me. It wasn't until I went away to school at the University of Colorado and I started experimenting with drugs that things started to shift. So it was I was introduced to Adderall, cocaine, and ecstasy all my freshman year. And I thought those were the miracle drugs because for me, it was, I was a good student throughout my life. And that was definitely an expectation that my parents had for me when I went away to school. So with Adderall, I felt like I could still study and, get the grades that I needed to, no matter how much I was partying, which was pretty much 7 days a week. With cocaine, I could be an even more outgoing version of myself than when I was just drinking alcohol. And again, I could, override this need for sleep that we all have. And then ecstasy just allowed me to take it one step further. And so, unfortunately, when you are on these kinds of drugs and you're drinking even more, that's when I started to really black out a lot of the night. I started to act way out of character. And what began as, going into school, kind of feeling like I was this fun party girl that was connecting with people. And it was all just very kind of like, you're just enjoying yourself. Yeah, you're getting a little too drunk, but then it started to get pretty dark where I was forgetting things. I was saying things to people that were really hurtful. I would be terrified to look at my text messages sometimes from the night before because like I would just send the most bizarre, angry messages that I didn't have an explanation for. So things like that started to happen. And, it was the second semester of my junior year that I kind of found myself on this rapid downward spiral where I could not get out of it. Like I would wake up in the morning and then it would be Bloody Marys and, on days that I didn't have class. And so eventually there was one particular morning where I woke up, I had blacked out most of the night before, didn't wake up until, the afternoon that day. And I was so overwhelmed with the little bits of the night before that I remembered. I just remembered like I could not face the day. I was just, it felt like way too much. I had to get out of there. And so I called my mom and I was like, please, can you get me out of here? Like, I need to get out of Boulder. I was in Boulder, Colorado. I'm from Chicago. Please fly me home. And she could hear like the panic in my voice. Like it was really like I remember this feeling so well in my body. But, before you know it, I was on a plane home the next day and in rehab at Hazelton in Chicago. And I did not call home with the expectation of I want to go to rehab and get sober. It was help me escape this drama that I've created around myself. I still wanted to drink. I still wanted to have fun. I just wanted to go back to that fun version of myself that could just drink and connect with people and dance and not wake up feeling anxious and hungover. But I found myself in treatment. And then I learned that, part of that means you're going to commit to being sober and working this recovery program. And it only took a few days to pass before I started to distance myself from all of these bad memories and all of the negative associations with drugs and alcohol and started to think, I don't belong here. I can figure this out. I'll become a normal drinker. I'll moderate. I'm not one of these people. And so I was very strategic with that 6-week period of going through treatment. I was on a medical leave from school. So I was away for 6 weeks, but I was very careful about how much I disclosed about my drinking and drug use because I didn't want them to say that they didn't recommend me going back to that environment because definitely was not a supportive environment for staying sober. So I didn't really engage so much, but the seeds were planted there for sure. I was exposed to recovery for the first time. At that time, I started practicing yoga regularly. My mom would take me when I wasn't in the treatment program, and I took that practice with me back to school, which was a huge step for me, that I was going into yoga and had this daily practice. But as soon as I got back to school after finishing that treatment program, I was very quickly back to drinking. It was going to be, I tried to moderate, of course, but it was a very short period of time before I was back to my usual drinking and using drugs. And so, fast forward, I graduated and I got a job at a digital media agency and found myself in an environment where, once again, completely normal to be work hard, play hard. And what happened at that point was that I started to feel really insecure about my cocaine use in particular, because I was no longer in an environment like I was at school where it was really normal to find that all the time at parties on any given day of the week. And people were kind of maturing past that and really focusing on their career. And I still had this intense craving for it. And so I started using cocaine in secrecy, which was something that I felt so much shame about. I would meet this drug dealer, and I would, of course, go out with the intention that I wasn't going to do it. I was just going to drink. And I would end up going out and meeting him and doing it anyway. And I was using drugs, secretly when I was out with friends in the bathroom. And then it escalated to going home sometimes and spending the night, all through the night, doing it in my bedroom. And I started to feel this overwhelming fear that something bad was going to happen, that I was going to be at a work event and someone was going to find out, or, all the things that could potentially happen, not to mention just the dangerous situations I was sometimes putting myself in. But, I didn't have some crazy thing happen or a rock bottom. What actually happened was it was one of those nights where I had gone out drinking and I found myself using cocaine alone, going home. I was blacked out, ended up doing drugs in my room, and I had this brilliant idea that I was going to go into the office anyways. And I was going to try to just, go to work. And I was, of course, like extremely high and thinking I've got this bright idea. I'm full of energy. And by the time I got there, it was well before anyone got in. I just sat down at my desk, and I remember I even tried to open up some of the spreadsheets and start working on this planning deck that we had to do. And I just had this opportunity to look at myself in that moment and be like, who are you? Like, what do you think you're doing? Like, how have you gotten in this position where it's gotten so bad? And unfortunately, I was really good at masking the extent of it from the outside world. I had a
Hmm.
great job at this advertising agency, but face to face with myself, it was like I couldn't stand it anymore. I was so disgusted with myself. And so I went home, and I knew at that point, if I was saying I'm going to go back to treatment, I'm going to ask for help, like that's it. I know how that goes. I know that this means that I'm admitting that I have a problem with alcohol and drugs, and the only answer is to get sober. And so that's when I decided to go back to treatment at the same place with an entirely different approach. I went back to Hazleton, and I've been committed to my recovery ever since then.
And the fact that you had that epiphany without that rock bottom, like, I think that that's something that a lot of people come to, but they just don't talk about, right? Where they want to make that change in life, like, the sober curious movement, like all of this. And at the same time, it's almost like it's that socially accepted norm. You have to have that rock bottom to make that change.
Yes.
What do you think it was where you were all of a sudden like, well, the best thing for myself is to really start to work the program that I was exposed to and make this decision to better my life?
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring this up, because I think that so many people are just waiting for their entire life to fall apart for it to be the sign that it's time to stop. And I think what it was for me was this incredible pain of disconnection. Like I was
Mm,
so out of alignment with the person that I knew myself deep down to be. And looking back now, I realize too that so much of that clarity came from my yoga practice. And I always like to tell people, like, I really believe recovery often happens before the moment you get sober. And it just so happened that, when you're on the yoga mat, you're cultivating this connection with yourself, and you're really having this opportunity to actually listen to that voice inside. And sometimes it starts as a whisper, but it gets louder, and it's uncomfortable to be with yourself when you're acting in a way that's so out of alignment. And that whisper started, I'll say, like the weeks leading up to that moment when I finally decided to actually ask for help. I had like this, it was almost like I was going around confessing. Like there was a couple of times when I was really, really drunk, and I had been using cocaine. And I remember I dragged my friend out of bed, and I was like, I just had to tell her everything. Like I was like, I was starting to be really uncomfortable with like feeling like I was keeping these secrets and being dishonest. And so I think that I think of it as like a pain of disconnection, of just being out of alignment. That was kind of the catalyst to like nudge me in a different direction.
and when you made the decision to go back, right? And embrace this program and really start to live the life that you wanted. When did you start to notice that you started creating that connection with yourself?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I was approaching that too, and it was interesting going back to the same exact treatment center and program that I did. It was Hazleton in Chicago, and just seeing how different my approach was, because the first time I was looking for ways to other myself from these people. I didn't want to be engaged with it, but when I went back that second time, I was seeing the similarities. And the truth was, no one in my group, because we sat in group therapy every day, no one in my group was my age, at my same position in life, had a similar career. And all I heard was similarities in their stories, like everything. And so I was like, there was that sense of connection, of just that on a very human level, of these things that we all struggle with, no matter like where we're born or what stage in life we're in, or all these different things. Like if you dig deep enough, like there was this shared connection there. But also, what I love about this was based on a 12-step model. And what was really interesting to me was that, and I've continued to find this interesting and study it even more, but the 12-step model follows a lot of the same core principles and teachings as yoga, as the 8 limbs of yoga. And so I was starting to see those similarities. And I think with this process of connection, there's these incredible, tools of the cognitive and spiritual tools that you find in the 12 steps, and working from a psychological perspective. And then you add yoga, And then you're bringing in the somatic piece with your body. And so you really are coming into this state of connection on all different levels, both, as an individual, physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, and then also with the other people in this group. So I would say that everything that I was doing at that time with my recovery was about feeding that state of connection.
And I love how you describe that too, because one thing when I made my decision to stop drinking was, oh, this is going to solve all my problems. This is going to make it so that I didn't know this at the time, right? But I'll find more connection. Um, and what it really did, and what I like to relate to people now, is sobriety didn't create more connection. It didn't, um, it didn't solve all my problems. What it did was it actually highlighted the disconnection I had with myself.
Exactly. That's such a good point, too, because also you have to recognize that usually we're using alcohol as a solution. I mean, it's not a good one, it's
Yes.
causing us more harm than good, but we have to replace that with other things too that are actually going to fulfill that need. But yeah, it's a really important point to make because, sometimes you remove the alcohol and that disconnection is so present and it's so painful that you want to go back to drinking to make yourself feel better.
Yes. And that's what you're highlighting there, is how alcohol is a form of self-care, right? And
Mm-hmm.
even, you know, the way that you started using cocaine and other drugs, like that was that comfort at one point. That was, you were doing something for a reason to help yourself. So when you all of a sudden you start looking at it from that perspective, you cannot be so hard on yourself. You can be a lot
Yeah.
more caring and compassionate. Um, and that's something that I think when we highlight that, it goes pretty far into giving yourself space to grow.
That is such an important point because, I used to drive myself crazy thinking, like, why can I not get this under control and everyone else can? Like, there's something wrong with me. But actually, if you take a step back and look at it, like all the behaviors I was engaging in, they were making sense for me at the time. I felt a lot of pressure to do well in school. So I was taking Adderall in order to allow myself to focus and keep going, like, and maintain this impossible work hard, party hard lifestyle. I had a
Mhm.
lot of deep insecurities that I wasn't aware of, and I was just drinking so I could feel social confidence. There were like all of the behaviors were making perfect sense. And not only that, it was so normalized. So it wasn't that I was crazy or that I was like, lacking morals or all of the other things we might tell ourselves. It's just that I was using the wrong strategy to meet a need that needed to be met.
Mm. And that's, wow. That's that's something. So I need to put a pause here if that's okay. Somebody was supposed to be here after 2, and I think they're here right now. They're at my door. I'll be right back.
Oh, yeah,
It,
no
it'll
problem.
be it'll be less than a minute. All
No
right.
problem.
Thank you. You too. Sorry about that. He was supposed to be here at 2:15. He
Oh, no
came now.
worries.
So, okay. So getting back to what you just talked about and like getting those needs met. And all of a sudden, at first you're like, oh, I'm getting these needs met. And so this must be the right way. But like you said, it's turns into that wrong way. And generally it's not necessarily a healthy way, but we look at it like it is because it might be the first time we're getting those needs met. How does that kind of spiral, do you feel like?
Yeah, well, I think in my case, it was so reinforced. Like I was getting a positive at the start. It was a positive reward, right? So I would drink, I would see myself as being more fun, more outgoing, and there were no consequences attached to it. And so I continued repeating that behavior, and the consequences were slow and they started to sneak up in subtle ways. And even some of the consequences were really normalized. So, I would wake up and exchange texts or, share with friends, talk about how we're so hungover or we feel so anxious. What did I say last night? But it was funny and it was normalized and it wasn't raising a red flag. And so by the time that continued to progress, I'm consuming a highly addictive substance in huge quantities on a regular basis. And so by the time that I started to realize, like, oh, these consequences actually feel a lot more painful, well, it's not that easy for me to stop anymore. It's not that easy for me to just cut back. Suddenly I realize, and I'm having this conversation with myself because I would never admit to anyone else at that time that I was having a problem with it. But internally, I'm going, okay, I'm not going to get that drunk tonight when I go out. And then I go out and I do. And I'm like, oh my gosh, what's happening? I can't control this. And this is all happening inside at that time. So it was difficult to break free from, especially at a time when I felt so much shame about it and I wasn't, ready or willing to ask for help.
And what are some ways in your recovery and being able to find different ways of getting those needs met that you've found have worked, maybe provided that similar dopamine that you were looking for, or whatever need it was that you were looking for, but it's in a more healthy way?
Yeah, definitely. So I think I was using substances a lot as a form of mood regulation. And so for me, and nervous system regulation, for me, having my yoga practice and starting to actually realize that I enjoy exercise over time, I've started to add other things. It started with just yoga and then hiking, and I love weight training now and fitness classes. And all of those things are really supportive in naturally elevating your mood and naturally managing stress and, things like that. And so that's been a really, really helpful tool for me and something that I honestly can't imagine my life without. Having a movement practice, breathing practice, mindfulness has been hugely helpful in that, when I feel overwhelming emotions, to be able to just pause and, notice what's happening inside and noticing what's available to me in order to shift that experience. Being aware of my environment and the ways in which that is triggering these behaviors. So it was very quick that I realized as soon as I got sober, I looked around in my office and I'm working at a digital advertising agency where I'm under all this stress during the day in artificial lights under a plastic cubicle. There's a beer cart that goes around my office. It's totally normal after a big drinking event to have like hangover food laid out on the counter. They're pretty much encouraging people into this like work hard, party hard lifestyle. And as soon as I got sober and I started committing myself to recovery and the path of yoga, I'm like, this environment makes no sense for me anymore. And so, I had to create an environment that really allowed me to step into this new identity and build confidence in this version of myself that I wanted to become. Because otherwise, I felt like I am this outsider in this environment and I don't I don't belong here. I'm not connecting with other people. And that was a huge part of drinking for me, was that it gives me this sense of social connection. And, at the time I thought that was belonging. Later, I've realized that true belonging comes from not having to be under the influence of this substance that disconnects you from yourself. And so, you know, recognizing how I was really going to get that need for social connection met. And, what I found was that was putting myself in environments where I could connect with people that had shared values, that were interested in the same things that I was in, not because we were all drunk, but because we genuinely enjoyed them. And I found so many new hobbies and activities, things like that along the way, because of that. But yeah, those were just some of the big things for me was, mood regulation, this feeling of social connection. That's really what I was seeking from substances the most.
And sitting and looking at what you were seeking and then finding ways to be able to actually get that and be like, okay, that's what I was seeking. Was I actually getting what I was seeking, right? With that connection. And it's like, was I actually getting connection when I felt like I was being socially connected? And it's like, no. I mean, go to a bar after 11 p.m. without drinking or having any substances and just look at people who are talking and who are chatting. Is there actual connection that you're seeing? And it's not. It is it very rarely, I should say, is that actually happening. So when you actually find it, it's almost a little scary at first.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, talk about what you're seeking. I had this realization, not only with social connection, but, seeking that high, like in
Mm,
cocaine, I was always looking for that like elevated experience. And it's so short lived. Like the high that you get from cocaine, it's so short lived. It's unbelievable. Like you're craving more the second you experience it. But I remember so clearly within my first year of sobriety, I was traveling and I was hiking. And I was someone who thought exercise was like, I dreaded it. I was something that like I would do anything to avoid. But, in my recovery, I started to really find joy in exercise. And I remember I was hiking and I had this moment. I was in the Himalayas and I was looking around and I was just so overwhelmed with this feeling of awe of like the beauty all around me. And at the same time, I'm getting that natural high from exercise. And I just remember being like, this is it. Like, this is what I was actually looking for. And it's so different because it's long lasting. It stays with me. It's not gonna, there's no crash and intense craving that comes after it. And that's just one example, but I realize that in so many things that bring me so much natural joy now, and it's not even big things. Like that was a really significant trip. I was on the opposite side of the world in an incredible mountain range, but I genuinely experienced that when I'm driving home in Colorado now, or when I'm watching the sunrise. And I have these moments of just like connection and just such a natural, elevated experience, and like the gratitude that arises from that, where I do stop, even years later, and I'm just like, this is it. Like this is what I used to chase so aggressively with substances. And it's like you're almost there, but you're not there. You just want more. And this feels like it's like a grounded kind of high, if that makes sense.
yeah, it does. It does. And I had so a friend and I started putting on alcohol free events and we started a company around that. And last night we held our first ticketed event that was a bunch of storytellers. And I was one of the storytellers. And we had mocktails for purchase. And it was by far the most attended event. It went off the best. But that feeling of social connection that we had was there to a point where it was that real thing that you're searching for, right? Like that real. I was vulnerable. There were two other speakers. They were vulnerable. The people, when we mingled, when we networked, it was like true vulnerability and people letting their guard down. And you were talking about belonging earlier, and it was just a space where you could belong. You didn't have to hide things and fit in. You could just be yourself. And I was driving this morning, driving my two kids to school, and I had that, what you were talking about with that grounded connection with myself, where I was like, this is this is amazing. I'm living my dream life. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago what my dream life would look like, I would not have said this. However, being open to that, connecting with myself, connecting with other people, like you're talking about, and being open to appreciating what is going on right now has led me to actually be living this life that I'm looking at. And I'm like, this is my dream life. And it's not the material possessions. It's not the things. I actually have less things than I've ever had. It's the the
Yes.
feelings, right? Like, yeah.
I love that example so much because like that was a real experience that you had of social connection at the storytelling event and you got to keep that. You didn't wake up the next morning if that was a, a substance high that you were out all drinking together and cheersing and you'd wake up the next morning with a feeling of anxiety, with depleted energy, you wouldn't have slept well. Like you don't get to keep that. That was something that wasn't real. That was something
Mm,
that was living in that substance, but with that experience that you had with your friends, I heard someone on my podcast refer to it as the ecstasy of connection. It's like that high we get from real connection. And like the fact that actually the next morning, it's the exact opposite if you had been drinking. Like you woke up with that feeling of like aliveness and connection. And it's just
yeah,
such an incredible thing.
it is. And what you just described too, how you don't get to keep that, right? And that's what I talk about a lot of times with mood regulation, or you have these feelings and you're like, I need to drink to allow myself to process this. And I like to equate that, right, to almost being like in a dream. Yeah, you're
Mhm.
processing it, but what you just mentioned, you don't get to keep that.
Mm.
You don't get to keep processing those emotions. Those emotions are still there because your brain wasn't there for you to actually process them. You turned parts off with the alcohol. And when you turn that off, now you process those emotions, but did you really? No,
No,
and you don't get to
yeah.
keep that.
That was such an eye-opening thing for me too, is because, when I was younger, I was like, I had this tough girl persona and nobody could ever see me cry. Like, I don't know where
Mm,
I got that. I just remember thinking, no one can see you cry. And I think it was because, like, I grew up with a lot of boys in the neighborhood and having brothers. But I never had the opportunity to really be with my emotions because first it was just stuffing it down, but then I found alcohol and then it was just numbing it out and suppressing it. And, you know, it took, I'm in my 20s for the first time that I'm actually feeling things fully and not using some sort of substance or escape in order to avoid it. And that's just the other thing that I think that we really don't recognize how much alcohol is taking away from us is this opportunity to like really know what's going on inside. If we're just going to numb that out or suppress it, like I think emotions, there's a lot of valuable information. And when we're feeling sad or we're feeling angry, it's like that gives us an opportunity to look at like what needs to shift here, like something, and if we just drink to escape that, we don't get that opportunity.
and this is where I think like that information, what you were talking about with yoga being kind of the gateway and being that connection to yourself and how it provides that mind, body, and spirit, soul connection, that holistic approach. Do you think that cultivating that connection allowed you to feel and understand what was going on inside of yourself more?
Oh my gosh, yes. And honestly, like it amazes me still with everything that we know about the fact that there is no separation of the mind and body. It's like we tend to approach physical health and mental health as two separate categories. Just think about any emotion, any thought or emotion has a physical imprint to it. If you started to feel anxiety, like sometimes, when I'm recording a podcast, I feel myself like I get a little bit nervous, but that's not something that lives in my head. I know that because my heart starts beating faster, my breath gets shallower. I can sometimes feel my hands actually shaking. And so, like, we tend to think sometimes of as thoughts and emotions as something that we just need to talk through or work through, on a cognitive level, as if there's not this connection going on in our body. And I think the huge missed opportunity with that is that we can also use our body and our breath to influence the state of our mind and our emotions. And so it goes in both directions. So for me now, like when I feel anxious and overwhelmed, I have things that connect me back into my body. I hold a stone. I'm holding it up right now. When I'm recording things or I'm, speaking to people, I hold like a stone in my hand that grounds me into my body. And sometimes I'll, if I feel stressed and I'm at home, I'll place, a hand over my heart and my lower belly, and I'll just connect with my breath. And these somatic tools are incredibly helpful with working through emotions. And I wasn't educated on that at all, but I knew something was happening. Like I remember when my mom took me to yoga with her the first time I was going to treatment, it was like, I don't know what's happening, but it's something good. And so I'm just going to keep going with this experience. And that curiosity is what led me to kind of study that further.
Ooh. And you have a couple of things there that were really interesting. And I love how you talk about we have disconnected the mind from the body and how you can't, right? Like that is the all-encompassing thing. And now that we know just how the nervous system works, all of this stuff, inside the somatic expressions of the emotions. And you mentioned taking notice of your breath. That piece is so important because it's that chicken or the egg scenario that we look at. I think life in general, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? And so many people are trying to be logical about it to answer the question. But the truth is, who gives a fuck, right? It could be the chicken, it could be the egg. That's the whole point. So for me, I worked on my mind for a long time before I started working on my body. And I know for a lot of people, working on your body leads to working on your mind. And just how you said, like, how connected that is, it makes sense. It makes total sense why one would lead to the other. And when you mentioned realize, like, seeing your breath and grounding yourself, what is a great place for people to start understanding how that can be used to regulate really difficult things going on in your life?
By practicing. Honestly, I think sometimes we want to like spend all this time consuming information and learning. I think by going and working with a breathwork practitioner or working with a yoga teacher that can teach, and now, on the apps, there's so many incredible apps online that can guide you through breathing practices that are super affordable, things on YouTube.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, starting to explore breathing practices and just notice how they affect your body and how they affect your system. And it can change in different times. Like I've benefited a lot from pranayama practices, from yogic practices. And I remember I was introduced to this form of transformational breath work that involved, like, it's called like a superventilation, where it's a very intense breathing practice that you do over a prolonged period of time. And the first time I tried it, I was like, this is way too activating for my system. I do not like this. But I came back to it about a year and a half ago during a really difficult time. And it was such a powerful way for me to process emotions that just felt really inaccessible to me through talk therapy or, other
Mm.
modalities. And I was like, this is incredible medicine for me right now. And so, I think just getting curious and trying things and noticing what comes up for you, and definitely doing that with the support of a teacher. Like I mentioned, using the apps and things like that. But if you can go and be in connection with another person and they can guide you through that process and talk to you about things that happened, especially if you're having an emotional response, that can be hugely supportive. But yeah, I think just getting in the practice and trying things. And the same goes with yoga and other, other physical practices. Like if you've been to one yoga practice before and you've thought, oh no, that's not really my thing. Well, there's so many different styles of yoga. There's so many different approaches to teaching it. There's also so many other body-based therapeutic practices. So really, I always encourage people, like, get curious, because you'll just keep adding to this toolbox of self-care practices, and you'll have ways to regulate yourself in all different forms of situations.
And that was the other part that you brought up, was like embracing that curiosity that I wanted to get to. And I want to get to that again. When you notice that you're curious about something, well, how do you follow that thread typically and really embrace that piece?
I would say when it comes to these kind of self-care practices, or it usually starts with an experience. Maybe I'll be introduced to it because I'll have heard about it. Someone shared about it on a podcast, or, to give a different example, I was living in Bali before, and the gym that I went to had a cold plunge in it. And I just started to be like, what on earth are people doing? Like, why would you ever get in this? And the first time I remember I got in and I just like sprung out, and I was like, no, 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 no. But then I had this curiosity, because I was like, this did give me like a little bit of like a buzz, like
Mm-hmm.
and then I started practicing more, and I was able to stay in longer. And I'm like, wow, this is a really powerful way to meet that part of myself that just wants to spring away from discomfort. And then it started to become something deeper, where I'm like, can I draw on some of my other practices in order to stay in this experience? And so as I got more curious and allowed myself to just, explore, and of course do like start to gather more information and guidance, that started to grow. And now that's something I really lean on and I love. But I think following those curiosities and then finding people who can guide you through it is hugely helpful.
I completely agree with you. And for me, like the curiosity, when you can open your mind and not punish yourself for being curious, that's like, that's the piece that is um eye-opening, right? And it opens those doors and changes perspectives. And so taking that and tugging on it, like if something like knitting, for example, it's something that has me curious the more that I learn about it a little bit. But and at first I was like, I'm never gonna knit. What? And now I'm like, look at the cool stuff I could knit. Why am I not doing this? And I actually, met some people that put on beginner knitting classes, and I'm going to sign up in the next month, because the next month is going to be a lot slower time period for me. I can do that, but I think deliberately and intentionally creating a space so that you can try that out, right? And find exactly what you're talking about. People who allow you to be a beginner, even if you don't
Yes.
yourself, the people who allow you to be a beginner so that you can allow yourself to be a beginner. That's really powerful.
I love that so much. And I feel like that's almost going back to this childlike state before we cared about expectations, like, oh, I can't be a knitter, or like, it's just,
Yes.
you would have just said, oh, this seems interesting. I'm going to try this. And I think that is the beauty, so much of the beauty of sobriety is that we've already made this decision that we've freed ourselves from this expectation and this societal norm. And so now it's starting to get curious about like, I've already moved away from this thing that everyone is doing and that I should be doing. It's like, what do I actually want to do that brings me joy? And sometimes we have to separate ourselves from whatever the narrative is. It's either like somebody else's story about who should be doing that or what it is, or maybe it's our own fears or limiting beliefs. Maybe we're too old at this time in our life to try something new. But I think that's one of the greatest gifts of sobriety, or it has been for me at least.
I agree with you completely, because, as you said, those moving away from those societal norms, we're already doing that. We don't recognize it and we don't give ourselves enough credit. I think especially early on, when you're looking at things and you look at it and like you're ostracized, you're on the outside, you're at the, now you're not a full grown adult right? You're put at the kiddie table. That doesn't have to be a bad thing when you can
Yeah.
embrace that childlike sense of wonder and give yourself that joy like you were talking about.
It
That
makes me
what
laugh when you
oh,
say that at the kiddie table, because when I'm at like family functions and stuff now, I'm like, can you put me at the kids table? Because I don't want to be, I don't really want to be at a table full of people who have been drinking for a couple hours before sitting down at the table. Like, I want to be with the group of people that's, more connected and present. And so it's just funny that you say that.
yeah. And what you're saying right now too is, and I just had this kind of realization. I think like early on when we're making this choice to move away from drinking or using those coping mechanisms that got to be destructive, we feel like we have to double down on being serious. And I wonder if it comes from that place subconsciously of I have to be more serious now in order to be an adult because I'm not doing those societal norms.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think, the interesting thing, and this is like actually what the inspiration behind Sun and Moon Sober Living was that embracing there's the darkness and the light, you know, when we're walking this path of recovery and we're committing to that, we are facing the challenging things. We're not numbing out and escaping anymore. We're recognizing that there is pain there and there are difficult emotions, and we're leaning fully into that. But we're also leaning fully into the lightness of it all and the joy and, those natural joys of life. And I think our life in that sense gets so much bigger when we remove substances, is because we're embracing all of it. And one of the greatest gifts I've found from the sober community. I feel like I keep saying one of the greatest gifts. There's so many gifts,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I hear you.
something that I think is so amazing with the sober community is that you have these relationships with people who are committed to the same thing. So you can share it all with them. You can go to them when you're having a really challenging day and when you're faced with something that feels too heavy to carry on your own. And you can also experience the fullness of your joy and laugh together. And you make such a good point. Like, there is so much lightness to it. It's not this really serious. We're not really serious all the time or processing. So much of it is just like, I think about, the moments of just laughing so hard with, friends who are also sober and things like that. And I think that we need to bring attention to that too, because sometimes we feel like we're missing out on something, when our life is going to go down in quality when we give up alcohol. And for me, that couldn't be further from the truth.
It's same, right? It's that I look at the people around me, a lot of them when they're drinking, and I look at the quality of the life that I had when I was drinking. And I'm like, what's the difference between those people or the quality of my life when I was drinking? Why do I think that that was so? I should say, why does my initial thought, right, be like that was so much greater than what I have now? And looking at it right now, it's like I said earlier, I'm not drinking alcohol. I'm making these connections. I'm living the life of my dreams. I really am. And it's about having that intentionality and just that authenticity that you're embracing of yourself. And that's really like a lot of what this conversation has been around is like that finding the peace with yourself so that you can get that um, belonging
Mm-hmm.
and just how special that can be.
Yeah. And I won't deny the fact that when you drink, it does feel like you get to take the super highway to connection. It kind of like short circuits that process. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. I was very addicted to that as a solution. The
Right.
only trouble is like, you don't have the opportunity to build that confidence in who you really are and express yourself fully. There's a
Mm,
part of you that is then believing I need something else in order to be okay in this interaction, versus, the depth of connection that you can find with someone when you're showing up as your true self and knowing that they are, you're connecting on that level and you're accepted and you feel that belonging as you really are. because I had a lot of fear when I got sober. I was thinking like, what's going to happen to my friendships? Like my identity is so much around drinking and, like, will I still be liked? And that was a
Mhm.
really scary feeling. And, there were some friendships that did start to fall away. And I started to realize like, wow, like the only thing connecting us was drinking and using drugs together. And then there were a lot that have stayed, like vast, vast majority. And that is also something that's really meaningful to me. But um, it's nice to know that you don't have to have that wonder of like, will they like me if I'm not under the influence of this substance?
Yeah. Yeah, that is having that is such peace inside, right? Where you don't have to have that if I do this, will they continue? And that peace is something that is priceless.
Yeah, because a lot of people will say, oh, I'm not addicted to alcohol. I'm not physically dependent. But if you go through your life with a belief in your mind that I need alcohol in order to be liked, in order to be accepted, then there is a level of dependence there,
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a wonderful conversation, Mary. As we're kind of winding down, is there something that you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah, I think, I would just say that if you're listening to this and you are starting to get curious about your own relationship with alcohol, one of the biggest limiting factors for me, and I kind of touched on this in the beginning, was like, am I an alcoholic? Am I bad enough? Is this who I am? Am I struggling with addiction? And we're so fortunate to be in a time now where that question has really changed and there is that space for curiosity. And it is a beautiful thing if you do not have to have any severe consequences for your drinking. If you can just simply have the awareness to notice, you know, even a little bit of suffering is maybe not something that I need to have in my life. What would it be like if I wasn't drinking that glass or two of wine every night? What would I do at that time? And what would I do with the energy that I woke up with tomorrow when I got a full night's sleep? And how would my life begin to shift when I start moving into alignment and living from this place of connection and clarity? Because I cannot even begin to tell you how much my life has changed as a result of this decision to quit drinking. And I think that's something that everyone can benefit from, no matter how much of a quote unquote problem that it is. So I would say, no matter where you find yourself, on this journey, to just really remain curious and try it. And as you do that, start to surround yourself with other people who are also on this journey of sobriety or sober curiosity, and just really make note of how your life changes for the better, because there is just you know, so much available to you when you're willing to do that.
Yes, absolutely. And how you said, am I bad enough? Like that hit me because there's so many people that, well, it's not that bad. I don't really want it in my life, but it's not that bad. So I'll keep doing it. And it's like, but if you don't want it, why are you doing it? And just,
Yeah.
yeah. Mary, if people want to follow you and stay connected, what's the best way they could do that?
Yeah, so you can follow on Instagram. It's at sunandmoon.soberliving. I share on there pretty regularly. And on my website, sunandmoonsoberliving.com, there's information about my membership community. So we meet once a week online over Zoom. We also have a really great chat group that's supportive, and it's a very welcoming, inclusive community of people who are sober and sober curious. And I also do retreats. So I spend a lot of time traveling, running retreats, and living in Southeast Asia. And I love bringing people together out in nature and kind of exploring all these topics while we're connecting in nature together. So I've got a few retreats coming up this year, and all the information is on the website.
Mm. Make sure you go check that out. Give Mary a follow. There's so much depth to what you share and that connection that you're talking about. And that's what That's what I think is special, is that it's not just that one size fits all. It's not just like that one approach. It's that all encompassing, and there's multiple different pathways. And that's so beautiful. And I appreciate that.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And also, my podcast, I had such a great conversation with you and received so many nice messages of feedback in response to what you shared. So I really appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And I'm so glad that we were able to connect.
Yeah, I am too. This was so good. And I feel like we could go for another hour, but I guess we're gonna have to save that for a to be continued. But again, go follow Mary on Instagram, sun and moon dot sober living.
Yes.
Dang it, crushed it. All right. I appreciate you all joining. Hit that subscribe button, share this with somebody who you think would benefit from it. It's Untapped Keg. And let's try to be better tomorrow than we were. Try to be better tomorrow than we were today, because at least we don't make it, we tried. Boy, words. Am I right? Have a great one, everybody. I love you.